You're now going to start to work on what's called your methods section. And the important thing to keep in mind, the sort of overreaching idea of the methods section, is that it's got to be so specific that any other researcher could go in and replicate your study. So they have to know specific concepts, ideas, sort of the who, what, where, when, why, and how that you did it so that they could duplicate it. Because again, that's how we build on other people's research, correct? You did that with your lit review. That's how you came up with some of the aspects of your study. So the first thing you need to say is what kind of sampling this is. Was it a convenient sampling? Was it a random sampling? And then you have to describe how you did that. You also have to describe when you did this. Did you do it over from January 2019 to January 2020? We need to know the time frame you did it. We need to know how you got your sample. So did you send out a survey in waves? If it was a random sample, then you randomly sampled a group, de-identified their name, for example, and then you sent it out to them in one wave, then waited 3 or 6 weeks, whatever response you got, then you sent out another wave. So you have to be very specific about how you did the study. Who did you do it on? Who are the inclusion and exclusion to your sample? So who was included, who was excluded? Was it all people working within the ER, nurses that worked within the ER at 2 locations? Describe those locations. Now, specifically, you don't want to necessarily say the names of those locations because, again, you don't want to be able to trace the information back to specific individuals. And if there's only 6 ER nurses at 2 ERs, then that's easy to do. So you might say, for example, one of the things we usually say in our studies is this study was carried out at a urban level 1 trauma, adult and peds trauma center that serves so many people per year, just so that we can get an idea of where the sample's taking place, who's included, excluded, when it is done. If you're doing a survey, you need to then say why you used that survey. Also say it's validated, so that means you have to cite all of the surveys you used. Say how often you gave it. If it was a pre and a post test, when did you give the pre, when did you give the post? Also say how many people you would try to get in your sample. We will actually say how many people we did get in our sample when we start to talk about results. But if you're trying to get a total in of 100, you were trying to get 100 students because that gave you a power of 80% potentially. Then you need to say who was trained, who gave the tool, who gave the training, why did you do a certain training if you did a training, was it a validated training? Again, cite that training as a validated training for de-stressing people, for example, and how you did it. Did you send it in waves? Again, what was the first wave? What was the second wave? Did you change anything? Those kinds of things. Did you do it at 2 locations at 2 different times? Again, I have to be able to look at your methods section and as a researcher, duplicate that research. So you need to specifically talk about who trained the trainers. So if you did a pre and a post test, you're going to say you've used a validated survey and you're going to cite that. If you did a training, you're going to say where you got that material. Was it validated? Again, you're going to cite that. If you trained somebody to deliver these things, then you're going to say again, how were these research fellows trained to give this survey? If it was on a computer, where was the computer located? Who had access to it? If people took these responses on a computer, how was their information de-identified? Again, you have to be very, very, very specific of what you did, why you did, and how you did it. Now, when you're looking at a survey, you're looking at specific variables that you're going to collect. Obviously, your survey will be in an appendix, but you want to say, for example, I wanted to measure certain levels of stress by this survey, and then give some key variables that you were looking for. Also, in your methods section, you're going to look again at that independent, dependent variable. If it's an intervention, I'm going to look at a pre and a post test, and after they have this computerized training, they will see a significant reduction of 20% in stress based on these 2 surveys, pre and post. And you could cite specific variables, i.e. questions in those surveys that you would expect to change in. Again, very, very, very specific: who, what, where, when, why, and how, because I have to be able to look at your methods section and be able to duplicate that exact study somewhere else so that I can see if I get the same results or not. So think it through, see if you've sort of ticked all those boxes. and then write that method section. Now, you've already administered your surveys, you've already administered your interventions, your educational components, all those kinds of things. So it's sort of going backwards and saying what you did. But also, again, cite those surveys, say those dates, say how many people you attempted to get. Talk about the locations where you did it. Describe those locations, not to the point of naming them, but describe those locations so I can identify where maybe you did it. Was it urban, suburban? Were these nurses students who are in their first year, their second year? Those kinds of things you need to identify.